That's a tough act for any preacher to follow, but I'm glad to speak today. The Martin Luther King holiday has always held a special place in my heart. In fact, the very first worship service that I ever led, fresh out of divinity school, the very first public ministry that I offered was an interfaith observance of Martin Luther King's birthday, hosted by the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Rutland, Vermont, exactly 40 years ago tomorrow. I had been officially called to serve the Rutland Fellowship just a week before, and I hadn't actually even been ordained yet. That happened the following Sunday, January 23rd, 1983, and I'll say more about that occasion next week. But here, for once, I was ahead of the curve. Although legislation had been introduced in 1968, not long after his assassination, King's birthday wasn't yet a national holiday. It didn't become one until November of 1983 when President Ronald Reagan reluctantly signed the law. But many people and institutions had observed it in their own way over the years. You may remember, some of you may remember Stevie Wonder's hit song, Happy Birthday, 1980 popular song, which actually played a significant role in mobilizing support for the creation of this holiday. Even after the law passed, though, there was resistance. I remember, for example, that the Unitarian Universalist Association pulled out of its General Assembly contract with the Convention Center in Phoenix because Arizona had refused to recognize the federal holiday. It cost us significant amount of money to do that, but on principle, we withdrew. In Vermont, we decided not to wait for federal authorization, so on very short notice, the Rutland Fellowship put together a service, got the word out to the other congregations, notified the press, and invited every person of color we could think of in Rutland. There were probably a dozen Black citizens in Rutland, a town of about 14,000 people at the time, in a state that was then, and perhaps still is, demographically the whitest in the nation. In front of the fellowship's building, facing out onto West Street, a major commercial route in that town, we had something called a wayside pulpit. Do some of you know what that is? A few of you? Yeah, New Englanders. Very common in New England. This was before the internet and websites. It was a physical, kind of a miniature billboard with a glass face you could lift up and replace inside the 3-foot by 5-foot white sheet with large, bold, black block printing of some inspirational message that passersby would see and perhaps associate with your church. But very common way to publicize your values in that time. So in Rutland, they had subscribed. It was a subscription service. You had a bundle of these messages sent to you, these 3 by 5 foot pieces of paper, and they had subscribed, but their subscription had long run out. But they'd saved all the old messages, and when I was called, it became my job to refresh the wayside pulpit, to put a message in there that I thought might resonate with the upcoming sermon title. But all the old messages were rolled up in you'll see next week, I think there's a tower. It was like a little miniature castle with a tower, and up in the top of the tower, these old scrolls, that's what they were stored away with pigeon droppings, and it was a mess. I had to go up there, and it was like going through the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, I had to unfurl these pieces of paper and find one. So sure enough, on that week, I did find one that said simply, "Unarmed love is the most powerful force in the world. Martin Luther King, Jr." Now, I don't recall what I said on the occasion, but I have always remembered that wayside pulpit message Was it a statement of fact? Was it a question? Was it a challenge? Certainly was a challenge. Unarmed love is the most powerful force in the world. Well, the service went well, and it was prominently covered on the front page of the Rutland Herald, Vermont's newspaper of record at the time, with a large photograph of candlelit faces of some of the African American residents who had shown up. So that was good, a good start. And then a few days later, I received my first ever piece of hate mail. And I actually saved it as a reminder of kind of a benchmark of what all of us are up against. As hate mail goes, I guess it was fairly mild, nothing like what Martin Luther King himself endured, as May Sarton said, hatred hard as hail. But I wanted to just kept this in my files and just wanted to share a little bit of it with you. Mr. Johnson, I was deeply disturbed and troubled by the recent article in the Herald about the bleeding heart service you held for that black creep, Mr. King. You and all the rest who took part in it are only hastening the day when this city will be crawling with blacks from other metropolitan areas who get wind of your permissive attitude, and with them will come all the crimes and horrors inherent in blacks, which we've been spared so far. And it goes on in language that I cannot and would not repeat. But even this, I think you get a sense of how that landed. And in one sense, I felt, you know what? We must be doing something right. You know, I felt that all along, and I've kept that as a kind of a reminder. The center of Martin Luther, the theme of the month is finding our center. The center of Martin Luther King's work and ministry was the creation of what he called beloved community. As early as 1957, in an address called The Role of the Church in Facing the Nation's Chief Moral Dilemma, the Civil Rights Crisis, the Reverend Dr. King said, Our ultimate end must be reconciliation. The end must be redemption. The end must be the creation of beloved community. It is love seeking to preserve and create community. It is the love of God working in the lives of human beings. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization. So beloved community, I think in King's vision, is a kind of paradox. On the one hand, it is a goal, or he calls it our ultimate goal. It's something we strive for. We're not there yet, but we're aiming to get there. And on the other hand, beloved community can be a present reality, a place where we stand and a place from which we begin. It's in the first case, it can refer to the widest and most inclusive community imaginable. I often ask, what about that anonymous author of the letter? In King's vision, he too is part of that beloved community. Hard to get one's heart and head around that, but that's the truth of it. On the other hand, beloved community can refer quite specifically to that particular community where one feels at home and finds support and encouragement and love. The Black church in particular was a haven in a heartless world to a degree that is hard to understand, I think, for many of us who haven't lived through that experience of oppression. Toni Morrison captured this beautifully in her novel Beloved when she has Baby Suggs, the lay preacher in the community, step out into the forest clearing and say, in this place, it's not a church building, but it's a gathering. It's a church. In this place, she says, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Yonder, they do not love your flesh. They despise it. You've got to love it here, she says. In his book, King Among the Theologians, Noel Erskine argues that the African concept of Ubuntu, the Bantu language, the concept of Ubuntu may very well have influenced King's concept of beloved community. The Bantu term Ubuntu roughly translates as, I am because we are. I am because we are. It's often a difficult idea for Western individuals to digest. You can contrast it with Descartes' famous dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. How different that is from I am because we are. Feeds on the community, the identity, and the power of the community. Around the turn of the 20th century, a Harvard philosopher named Josiah Royce had actually coined the term beloved community as a kind of secular synonym or euphemism for the kingdom of God. That was his understanding of what he meant. It was a way of pointing to that same, whatever that phenomenon was that the early church called the kingdom of God, or Jesus called. Joyce thought the language of beloved community said essentially the same thing in a language that was accessible in a modern democratic society. In an article entitled King's God, The Unknown Faith of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., published a few years ago in the progressive Jewish magazine Tikkun, Robert James Schofield reviews the theological sources, the thinkers, and writers that influenced the young Martin Luther King in college and later in graduate school, first at Crozer Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, and then at Boston University, where he earned a PhD in systematic theology. Schofield concludes that while Dr. King served a Baptist church, his first choice of religion was Unitarian Christian, which later merged with Universalism. Dr. King's liberal faith, he says, resonated with the dynamic Unitarian Christian tradition because of his acknowledgement of the truth in all religions, his view of Jesus as an exemplary teacher, and his rejection of biblical literalism. Coretta Scott had been attending Unitarian churches for years before she met and married Martin, and they both attended Unitarian services while in Boston. He ultimately faced the reality that he would probably not be able to play a role in the civil rights movement in this tradition, and thus he became pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, shortly thereafter being elected to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, is this just another example of our tendency to claim as Unitarian Universalists anyone who has ever crossed the threshold of one of our churches or has had a nice thing to say about us? Critics have sometimes accused Unitarian Universalists of performing, like Mormons, post-mortem baptisms on our purported ancestors. Because we are such a relatively small religious movement, demographically speaking, it's understandable that we may want to plump up our numbers and enhance our profile a bit by including marginal cases, especially if they happen to be famous. And if they're dead, they can't protest. But this practice is disingenuous at best and distasteful in its air of quiet desperation. I'm happy to recognize as a Unitarian Universalist anyone who has demonstrated a commitment to institutional life in one of our congregations through membership or longstanding affiliation, but I think we often protest too much, claim too much. To say, as one of our marketing campaigns did some years ago, that so-and-so was a Unitarian without knowing it is particularly wrong-headed and insulting. It conveys a message, perhaps without realizing it, that it's okay to be oblivious with regard to one's spiritual identity and heritage. At any rate, Schofield's assertion is interesting. Actually, Dr. King was strongly influenced by Unitarian and Universalist thinkers. For example, he was fond of quoting Theodore Parker, the great 19th century abolitionist Unitarian preacher, who said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." It's Theodore Parker. He was quotable even in his own time. Lincoln got his memorable phrase, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people," directly from Theodore Parker. So, but I want to talk about a different Unitarian thinker. It's well known that Martin Luther King was reluctant to assume leadership of the Montgomery bus boycott. He was new in town. His middle-class congregation didn't particularly use the buses that much anyway, and he was looking for a quiet place to finish his doctoral dissertation for Boston University. His dissertation topic was a comparative study of the thought of the great German-American theologian Paul Tillich and that of the lesser-known but still important and influential Unitarian thinker Henry Nelson Wyman. I should have had a picture to show you of Wyman. He taught for many years at the University of Chicago, where he was one of the founders of what came to be known as empirical theology, an approach to religious life that was consistent with science and scientific method. It was focused on direct experience rather than speculative metaphysical ideas. And it was pragmatic in its perspective. All ideas, including especially theological ideas, were for the sake of action in response to some practical problem. So what was that problem for Wyman? In his own intellectual autobiography, late in life, he said, "The problem that has engaged me for the past 50 years can be put in the form of a question. What is it that operates in human life with such character and power that it will transform men and women as they cannot transform themselves, saving them from evil and leading them to the best that human life can ever reach, provided that they meet the required conditions?" Again, there's no theological language there, but that to him is the ultimate question. It's a modern, updated, secular, and operationalized version of the ancient question, what must I do to be saved? This existential question of salvation hasn't gone away in our sophisticated technological age. It persists. We may use different language. For many Orthodox Christians, the answer to that question is some variation of faith in Jesus Christ. That's what saves us. For Wyman, that's not so simple. His answer was something that he called creative interchange. He did not insist on using the word God, but he thought that the experience or event of salvation as healing, as transformation, was real, absolutely real. And the divine for Wyman did not take the form of a supernatural being, but of a quality of experience, a happening in space and time, a certain kind of experience that he described as the source of human good. And he called it simply the experience of creative interchange. Creative interchange comes about through deep dialogue, interaction, trusting, open communication with one another in community. It is, in fact, a kind of equivalent to what King meant by beloved community. And as I say, he was the subject of King's doctoral dissertation. He was very much influenced by Wyman's ideas. So this creative transformation is, or creative interchange is something that happens among and between people. It doesn't come from above. It arises within community. I was thinking of a story I was telling Diane about a colleague of mine in those early years when I was first in Vermont. She was in Maine. Her name was Kitsy Winthrop. It struck me, she was a Winthrop from the Mayflower Winthrops, the Governor John Winthrop, descended from that New England heritage. So I was puzzled why she had a name like Kitsy. Her name was actually Catherine, and she was an ardent feminist, a passionate social activist, wonderful colleague. And I remember once being in a meeting with her, and she was talking about some social action project, and she said, we're all working for the kingdom, and everyone just kind of sat back. We knew her feminist credentials. We were surprised to hear that word come out of her mouth, and she realized it herself, and she corrected her and said, "Oh, I mean the queendom." And that didn't sound quite right either. So she said, "Oh, the in-betweendom." And I've always remembered that phrase. The in-betweendom is a very good description of what Wyman meant by creative interchange. It's what happens between us. What is sacred, what is divine, what is holy is not up there, and it's not even in here. It's between us as we interact with authenticity. The divine shows up, if it shows up, in that sphere of the between. The great Jewish thinker Martin Buber called it der Zwischen, the realm of the between. That's where it is, not in you or in me, but between us. So that's what Wyman meant. That's what Martin Luther King meant by beloved community. It's the quality of our interaction with one another. That was Wyman's idea of what and how the divine actually operates in the world. And he would insist that is always happening somewhere. One of my professors in divinity school, Harvey Cox, used to say that the church should be like a floating crap game. I don't know if any of you remember, was it Guys and Dolls? Yeah, it moves around from place to place. So the church, he said, should be like that. Go where the action is. Go where the creative interchange is happening. Doesn't have to be in the church, it's more likely in the world. Wherever that is, go there. Participate in that creative interchange. It's a floating crap game. Maybe here one day, somewhere else tomorrow. So, the other point I think that's important to mention, and I'll just quote Wyman directly here. He says, this creative event can't be used to shape the world closer to my own heart's desire, because in the process of participating in this beloved community, our own heart's desires will be transformed. We'll want something different from what we wanted in the beginning. Our desires will be expanded and transformed by that process. And that truly worked in Martin Luther King's ministry in that way. Someone said, more than one person has said, Martin didn't make the movement. The movement, by this we mean the civil rights movement, the movement made Martin. He stepped into that, at first reluctantly, stepped into that conversation, that dynamic interaction, that creative interchange, and he was transformed in the process as well as being a catalyst for the work toward justice. Well, there's a lot more that I could say here, but I'll just conclude with a story uh, that happened in 1917 as Diane and I were driving back up from the General Assembly in New Orleans. So, yes, it was long ago, 2017. We were driving up through along this great river. We had followed it down and came back, and we were listening on tape, books on tape, to the recently released book called The Murder of Emmett Till, as we were driving through that very landscape where that occurred. And I remember how many times one or the other of us would say, "You gotta turn that off. I can't listen to that anymore." It was just awful, terrible, and important, crucially important. So we got to Memphis and got to the Lorraine Hotel and the Civil Rights Museum. Unfortunately, it was closed on Tuesdays when we were there. But we walked around outside and got a good sense of the lay of the land. And I was particularly struck by a plaque outside the motel that contained a quotation from the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph and his brothers. Some of you, I quizzed a couple of people. Some, you may not know this story, but some of you know Joseph's brothers were terribly jealous of him. He was known as the dreamer, and they conspired together to kill him. They threw him down a pit. He didn't die, but this is part of the story. It's a good story. I mean, it's an important story. So the quote was, "They said to one another, 'Behold, here comes the dreamer. Let us slay him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams.'" His dream was a dream of beloved community. And like all dreams, it's multi-layered, many dimensions, many meanings. But it's that dream which we continue to aspire to live within, to live toward that dream of beloved community.